For a very long time, Berserk was identified as Berserk not because of an object, but because that was the nature of its world. In the very first chapter of Berserk, after seeing the carnage Guts was capable of, Puck exclaims his new companion is Berserk, and that was that. It wasn't until 200 chapters into the manga that we got a weapon that was named after the title of the series, and all we have to say is if Puck thought Guts was Berserk before, his opinion now is that he needs to keep his friend from losing himself to the darkness. That's the kind of effect the Berserker armor has on people. One of the most dangerous weapons crafted, not just in Berserk, but in all of fiction, the Berserker armor turns its user into a killing machine reminiscent of the Viking warriors of old. But in exchange, it takes everything from them, until they have nothing left to offer. And there are many questions that still remain unanswered regarding this extremely dangerous fetish. But worry not, marvelous viewers, that's where we come into the picture. So, without further ado, this is the Berserker armor's anatomy. Explore. How does the Berserker armor work? Is it indestructible? The Berserker armor first appeared in chapter 222, and the way Flora said she hoped she wouldn't have to use this was our first hint that this fetish wasn't to be played with. Well, that and the fact that Skull Knight seemingly gave it to her to watch over. Doubly ominous stuff. Even Shirkei wasn't sure why her mistress was insisting on putting a heavily injured Guts inside of such a dangerous contraption, but it becomes clear the moment the armor activates. See, right before acquiring the Berserker armor, Guts had battled a partial manifestation of the God Hand member Slan in the overlapping interstitial region of Kliphof. On his way back to Flora's Spirit Tree mansion, he realized she was under attack from apostles, and he dove straight into the battle despite being far from fighting shape. During his encounter with Slan, Guts sustained an injury to not just his physical body, but his astral body as well. Such injuries were not easily healed, and if Guts wasn't given the proper kind of medical attention, his wounds would never close, and he would bleed to death. Guts went in to defend Flora's mansion with what was essentially a band-aid trying to reattach a severed limb. He would have probably been fine if he only had to fight a few low-level apostles, but when Grunbeld, the Flame Dragon Knight, challenged him to a one-on-one duel, things went left rather quickly. Guts got absolutely thrashed about, his wounds reopened, and he wasn't sure he could tank another hit from Grunbeld's Warhammer, having had his bell rung by the first. He needed armor at the very least to defend himself, and lucky for him, Shirkei was standing by with a whole set. Well, we say lucky now, but you'll see why the opposite is true as the video progresses. After faking out Grunbeld and getting their comrade to safety, Shirkei and co get Guts into the armor. Immediately, he stands up, which is a good sign considering he could barely crawl a moment ago. But Berserk being Berserk, he ends up getting swallowed by an apostle the moment he gets his new armor. The mouth-bellied monstrosity walks into the open field of the mansion seemingly triumphant. After all, with his rows and rows of teeth, chomping down on a dude in armor should have felt like eating cheesecake. But turns out he's lactose intolerant because Teeth Guy begs his friends to save him from the pain in his stomach. The source? A still surviving Guts mincing through his guts with Dragon Slayer, pun very much intended. As soon as he turned his attacker into Haggis, Guts gets jumped by a giant centaur-like apostle, who also chomps down on him down to his waist. This dude gets sliced open like a pig on a slaughter block by the Black Swordsman. These two instances immediately tell you how incredibly durable the Berserker armor is. Usually, any kind of armor Guts uses, or anyone else for that matter, gets busted up pretty quickly when facing apostles. You needn't look beyond the eclipse to know whether these demonic entities can chew through plated metal. If you haven't read or seen Berserk in any of its forms, spoiler alert, they can. While the strength of an apostle is relative to their circumstances of creation and the form they're in, it's safe to say that once you get caught in their jaws, there's no safe return for you. The Berserker armor basically brushed off the biting force of its assailants and goes on to endure far worse abuse in the series, without ever catching so much as a dent. It's made from an extremely resilient material that's on par with Dragon Slayer in terms of sturdiness and far lighter in terms of mobility. In fact, it could be even better than Dragon Slayer structurally, as it does not require reforging after multiple uses to maintain its efficiency. We never see the Berserker armor go anywhere near a forge for a repair, despite it having been in the story for over 150 chapters at this point. Conversely, we see it withstand the flames of Grunbeld in his Dragon Apostle form and come out practically unharmed. The armor also shows no signs of environmental damage either, as it goes from dense temperate forests to the harsh western oceans and then the tropical island-like climate of Elfhelm, all without a single hint of rusting or erosion. It can also repair itself when it does get breached, which, yeah, pretty much makes it indestructible. Now that we have the durability question out of the way, let's talk about how it works. because you might think that the job of armor, any armor, is to provide its wearer protection, and the Berserker armor being an indestructible, non-weathering, self-repairing set of armor accomplishes said job perfectly. But the reality is that those things are perks associated with the armor. Its primary function is to eliminate the anatomical limitation known as pain. For many of us, pain is a sensation that is so undesirable, we do everything we can to keep ourselves from feeling it. But pain also acts as a natural limiter that tells you when other things are harming you, or worse, when you're harming yourself. When you try to stretch your back after a long day of typing, why does it hurt? Because it was locked in a certain position for so long that movement itself is straining your back, causing you to experience it as pain. You can throw a decent punch within your range of movement, but if you try to go beyond it, you can end up pulling a muscle, throwing off a nerve, or worst case scenario, dislocating your shoulder entirely. All of those things would make you feel pain, which would end up limiting your future performance as well. What the Berserker armor does is it dampens the sensation of pain to the point it becomes meaningless. When Guts first dons the armor, he's shocked that all his pain seems to have ebbed away, like it simply doesn't matter anymore. When we see him in action next, all of his movements are boosted to a point where he seems less swordsman and more natural calamity in armor. Before putting on the Berserker armor, Guts could barely land a challenging blow on Grunbel. Now, he was catapulting himself towards the Flame Dragon Knight like a hurricane, with Miura even drawing the trajectory of his armor's cape like his physical strength increases to the point Grunbel questions whether he's even facing the same man anymore, and Guts can execute literal anime maneuvers, like a vertical spiraling sword slam, where his previous best physical accomplishment was his horizontal 360-degree cannon-assisted slash of death. Thanks to the stat boost provided by the armor, Guts can brutalize his way past anything organic, and he can even crack the corundum skin of Grunbel, which is supposed to make him a near indestructible apostle. Without pain acting as a player in the game, Guts can hack the entire thing and wipe out legions of enemies within seconds. On the surface, it sounds great, right? An indestructible armor that takes away pain from your body to unlock its full physical potential? Well, all good things come at a price, as they say, and the prices the Berserker armor exacts are nothing to be scoffed at. How does the Berserker armor threaten its user's life? Why is it similar to Viking Berserkers? You didn't think that armor with such overpowered abilities would come without significant drawbacks, did you? Well, the Berserker armor's core ability is to negate the concept of pain and turn its wearer into a ruthless killing machine. The inner machinations of the same aren't as benevolent or even good as we made them seem in the last section. The reason that the wearer of the Berserker armor doesn't feel pain isn't exactly because their nervous system has been made immune to it, it's because their negative emotions boil up to the surface to the point where the sensation of pain can now simply be ignored. Think about it. Have you ever been in a situation where you were so emotionally charged that you didn't realize you ended up injuring yourself? The best on-screen example for this that we can give is probably that Leonardo DiCaprio scene from Django Unchained. We all know the story by now. Leo got so into his character as Calvin Candy that he ended up accidentally smashing a glass ashtray with his hand that he wasn't supposed to, and just kept going like nothing had happened. A lot of people think this shows Leo's physical toughness, and while it is a ballsy feat, we grant him that, it's more of a psychological achievement than a physical one. Leonardo DiCaprio is known to live his roles, and in that moment, his character felt such intense rage at having been played by Django and Schultz that the pain of broken glass in his palms became irrelevant. Tarantino kept this take for the final cut of his film, and you can clearly see why. What we're saying is the Berserker armor basically keeps its wearer in that frame of mind for as long as they're wearing it. Anger, malice, fear, these become the basis of the user's motivations. Why does this happen? That's because of the way the armor was made. The Berserker armor is imbued with a rather ominous ode. Ode, in the world of Berserk, essentially refers to spiritual energy, and the spiritual energy residing within the armor unlocks the darkest aspects of its wearer's personality. Rage becomes fuel for the painless fury of the wearer, and everything goes red once the wearer's ode and the armor's ode are in sync. Because Guts already harbors a deep darkness within himself, which he had been holding back ever since he took on companions, his mind is especially susceptible to the armor's influence. And once it enters that state, he strives only for one thing: to vanquish whatever is in front of him, no matter the cost. That last phrase goes deeper than you think. The main aim of the Berserker armor is to keep its wearer pushing forward in a fight. Everything it does is in service of that, including its twisted healing that threatens the wearer more than it helps them. You see, while the Berserker armor itself might be mostly invulnerable to everything it endures, the wearer is not. With each limit-breaking feat Guts performs, he puts his own body at the door of death. The armor doesn't negate the impact of the blows he takes, nor does it remove any of the consequences of Guts performing feats that would normally break his his limbs. After his first blitz against Grunbeld, Guts' entire body starts bleeding. The blood seeps through every crevice of the armor, which is alarming considering the Berserker armor is a full-body suit. Not feeling the pain of a cut doesn't mean that you haven't been sliced open. If left unattended for too long, you risk bleeding out. That's exactly the kind of risk the Berserker armor puts its user's life at every time it's brought into the picture. It is highly adaptable armor that can turn anyone into a killing machine. Don't get us wrong, heck, the Berserker armor even adapts to Guts' cannon arm and creates openings for him to use it whenever needed. But when every move you make could potentially be your last, that kind of power loses its allure. And to make matters worse, the Berserker armor heals its user in the most ghastly way imaginable. When he transforms into his apostle state, Grunbeld takes on the size and mass of a mini fortress. One swing of his corundum-crusted tail would break apart buildings with ease. When he tries to do the same to Berserker Guts though, Grunbeld is shocked to not only be stopped, but repelled entirely. This would have been an impressive feat of strength had it not come with a horrifying caveat. The blow broke Guts' left arm and leg, both of which tried to slow down the tail's impact. But in what is perhaps the most sickening panels in all of Berserk, right up there with chapters 86 and 87, the Berserker armor pierces Guts' flesh and bones and snaps his limbs back into place. While this sounds like a form of healing, comparing it to a puppeteer bandaging damaged puppets with pins and needles instead of thread would be more accurate. As soon as those needles are removed, the puppet would fall into disrepair once again. Unless the puppeteer sews it back into shape, there will be no healing it to its original form. Every time he suffers a limb dislocating blow, Guts becomes that puppet, and the Berserker armor, the nail and needles. The rearrangement here also only lasts as long as the armor is being worn, and once you remove it, you'll have to deal with the consequences of everything. It took Guts days, we repeat days, to recover from the effects of his first usage of the armor. Also, while it can improve your fighting abilities and battle senses, those senses can still be used against you, like we saw in Guts' fight with the Sea God. As he approached the god's heart, he defeated everything in his path, but couldn't block the sonic booms being produced by the beating of the heart itself because it was a force the Berserker armor just couldn't adapt to. He was effectively flying blind and relied completely on Astral Shirke's directions to stab the heart and finish the job. And as if armor that boosts your stats at the cost of your own life wasn't enough of a cursed tool, the Berserker armor also leaves you open to possibly attacking your own allies. It all comes back to the way the armor works and the inspiration behind its naming. As he watches Guts fight with an inhuman form and strength, Serpico notes that he's essentially like a Berserker warrior of yore. Kentaro Miura drew a lot of inspiration from real-world myths and cultures for his story, but this is one that he basically straight up lifted. In ancient Norse myths and folktales, Berserkers are warriors that were said to have fought with little to no regard for their own lives. Said to be able to withstand fire and iron because of the trance-like state they fought in, they were feared by both enemies and friends alike. Sources differ as to whether Berserkers fought bare-skinned or covered in shirts made of bear, wolf, or boar skins, as the word Berserker actually means bear shirt in Old Norse, but all agree that Berserkers were the best shock troopers available in the worst sense possible. The trance-like state they fought in was likely induced by narcotics, as Nordic cultures were known to dabble in psychotropic drugs, and it basically made them immune to the effects of whatever they endured on the battlefield. You can see now why we say Miura basically lifted the concept of a Berserker from real life and plopped it into his story. Guts can weather any attack from sword or flame well within his armor, and the bloodthirsty battle trance he enters makes it difficult for him to differentiate between friend and foe. When all you see is red, the form of what's in your sight makes little difference. On at least 2 occasions, Guts has considered attacking his allies in his Berserker state. Once, he even advanced on them, and was only stopped thanks to powerful intervention. We'll touch on who that intervention came from in just a bit, but now you see why we refer to this armor as the most dangerous weapon in all of anime. Which brings us to our next question. Who created the Berserker armor, and why? It's kind of funny to think that we knew so much about the creation and nothing of its creator for over 130 chapters, but that was exactly the case with the Berserker armor. It wasn't until chapter 361 came around that we finally learned who created it, and also got an inkling of why. In chapter 226, Shirke mentioned that the Berserker armor was a fetish created by dwarves. In chapter 361, we meet the dwarf who created it, the master blacksmith, Hanar. Dwarves have long been associated with the crafting of overpowered magical weapons in mythologies the world over, and there is actually a Hanar present in Norse mythology, which seems to be the primary inspiration for the armor's creation. Hanar is also the creator of Skull Knight's skeletal armor, so there is that as well. Given that he resides on Skellig Island and is a member of the Elfhelm community, it raises the question, how did Hanar's creation end up in Flora's spirit mansion, which lies on the mainland of the physical world? After all, Elfhelm lies deep within the interstice as one of the strongest spiritual locations in the astral world. The answer lies in the reason for the Berserker armor's creation, at least according to us. Now, if you've seen any of our videos, this reminder might sound like old news, but Skull Knight, we believe, is the vengeful soul of Supreme King Geiserit, the man who united the continents of man under his sole rule 1,000 years ago. This is pretty much confirmed when SK visits Elfhelm and meets Guru Gedfring and later Hanar, both of whom call him King or Your Majesty, just like Slan did in Cliphoff. Gedfring also says that he used to attend Skull Knight's town halls back when he was a child, which, once again, pretty much throws SK's human identity in our faces. What's interesting is that the Skull Knight was the previous owner of the Berserker armor as well. He says as much himself when he first encounters Guts after the latter gets the armor. This means that the last time it was used was 1,000 years ago, back when Skull Knight was still human. As for why he wore the Berserker armor as a human being, well, there can only be one reason grand enough in our opinion: world domination. In chapter 53, we learn that King Geiserit was known as the Skull King, or the King of Galloping Death, by enemies and allies alike back in his day. This was not just because he would leave mounds of corpses in his wake during his global conquest, it was also because he, according to Charlotte, donned a skull-shaped helmet for battle. Considering the fact that this armor was most likely the Berserker armor itself, we can now understand why he would get such terror-inducing nicknames from the people who didn't know him. During the Elfhelm arc of Berserk, we learned that at one point in the history of the island, it was attacked by Viking raiders, which is just another name for Vikings in the series. Geiserit himself was most likely a Viking chieftain back in his day. Once he arrived at Elfhelm and realized the magical potential of its inhabitants, he must have commissioned the Berserker armor's creation. Then, he went on to use it to create his global empire. Following his incarnation into the Skull Knight, Geiserit must have realized the folly of his human ego and had Flora keep the armor under wraps. That is, until the day Guts & Co. came to her mansion and SK realized it was time for the armor to write a new story for itself. And yet, he constantly warns Guts of this new weapon of mass destruction he's acquired because what happens when you wear the Berserker armor too long? As the previous user of the Berserker armor, Skull Knight is well aware of what it does to the user's body, and let us tell you, it's nothing so pretty as a few bruises and cuts. As we mentioned in the section discussing how the armor threatens its user, the Berserker armor often leaves its wearer in incredible amounts of pain and distress once it's taken off. Guts was convalescing for weeks after first using the armor, and he has barely taken it off since, only when he's in a medical emergency or resting. But even sporadic use of the Berserker armor is extremely dangerous, because as we told you earlier, it makes its wearer move towards their goals no matter the cost. When a person decides to work out until they can't anymore, and they do it regularly enough, they can end up destroying their own muscles instead of strengthening them due to overexertion. David Goggins is not a human being, so this statement doesn't apply to him, but the Berserker armor takes this concept and applies it to all 5 of a person's senses, until none of them work anymore. The cost of attaining limit-breaking strength can't just be mere muscle atrophy. When the wearer of the Berserker armor aligns with its ode and negates their pain, they end up sacrificing a portion of their senses to it. Over time, the effects add up, until finally the person can no longer function normally without the armor. Even after wearing the armor and using its full power only once, Guts starts experiencing loss of vision, taste, and develops a nervous tremble in his arms, all of which get worse as the series progresses. He's reached a point in his life where he can no longer swing his sword if it isn't wrapped to his arm, and he can only vaguely make out the shape of who he is seeing. This goes away when he wears the armor, as besides taking pain from him, it imbues him with all the senses necessary to become a killing machine. When Guts enters the dark belly of the sea god, devoid of any light, his eyes adjust to the environment immediately, and he can see as if he has night vision. But right after sailing away from the sea god's island, his vision deteriorates significantly, as he only takes off the armor one more time after that, right before the Moonlight Boy shows up in chapter 363. Wearing the Berserker armor too long without a regulating presence can eventually lead to the user's death, because if they keep fighting in the mindless Berserker state, they'll bleed out eventually thanks to their wounds. Wearing it for short amounts of time ends up robbing you of your senses, and that isn't a good way to live when you've known taste and sight and smell your entire life. Either way, it's a raw deal for the person wearing it, which does beg the question, is the Berserker armor aware of the effects it's having on its user? Does the Berserker armor have a consciousness of its own? How is it reflected by its user? At several points in the story, it appears as though the Berserker armor is actually alive, and there are things that the armor does that suggest the same. For instance, when Guts is fighting the Makara before reaching Vertanis, one of them manages to grab him in its jaws and crunch through its breastplate. The Berserker armor not only closes the gaping hole in his chest with its surgical spikes, it also repairs the hole in itself to make it seem as if nothing ever happened. Its intuitive fixing of limbs and utter devastation of targets makes Guts feel like he isn't himself. Even his friends note that the Berserker Guts is less Black Swordsman and more Black Beast. And To top it all off, we have to discuss the manifestations of the armor's influence in its user's mind in the form of their inner beasts of darkness. As we told you guys earlier, the Berserker armor is imbued with a rather sinister ode that turns its wearer into feral beasts, essentially. In return, the armor's helmet takes the shape of whatever form its user's malice takes in their own mind. This is why the Berserker armor had a skull-shaped helmet when Guts got it, and it changed into the wolf-like death mask that has become iconic today. The skull was reflective of its previous user's inner darkness, aka Skull Knight, and the wolf is the reflection of Guts' inner malice, aka his lupine beast of darkness. The reason it feels that the armor is sentient is because the first time Guts puts it on, he experiences a massive surge in negative feelings and witnesses his beast of darkness take form in his mind's eye. But we have to remember here that the beast of darkness is a mental construct Guts created to deal with his own malice. Guts has gone through things that would be unimaginable for you and I. He has definitely done things that we would never do, and it has left him a little broken. Him separating the beast from his own psyche is his way of coping with his personal trauma. It's not reflective of the armor itself having a life of its own, though there is one other thing that kind of suggests the same, and this is where a regulating magical presence becomes so important for the user, as well as the regulation of one's own emotions. Flora was well aware of the magnetism of the Berserker armor's ode. She was Skull Knight's old running buddy after all, and knew of all the risks the armor posed to someone like Guts, who was filled with suppressed malice. So she placed a talisman on the armor to protect his ego from completely collapsing into the armor's ode. Her apprentice Shirke has, on multiple occasions, used this talisman and her own luminous body to pull Guts out of his Berserker state. But when he entered this space for the first time, she had to go through a landscape of gnashing teeth and violence, which we interpret as being the Berserker armor's influence setting up a barrier against her perception. And because it takes the shape of Guts' inner beast of darkness, it looks like a wolf's jaws. Chapter 373 did make it seem like the Berserker armor has a consciousness of its own when the beast of darkness manifested from out of nowhere, but given the fact that Guts didn't go berserk when Silet's men captured him, we can chalk that up to a mental hallucination. Had it actually been the armor taking control, all our heroes would be dead, and Berserk would end tomorrow. So we can rule out the Berserker armor having a consciousness of its own. It's just as well, because Guts already has a lot going on in his head. Another evil presence is the last thing he needs in his life. But speaking of evil presences, will the Berserker armor end up killing Guts? This is a question we're pretty sure even Guts asks himself on a daily basis, and we're afraid to say that the answer is looking more and more affirmative as the days pass. While it is true that the Berserker armor will eventually kill him anyway, there is a workaround to making it work for you, instead of you succumbing to it. Guts discovers this and uses it to his advantage on many an occasion. By keeping his mind focused away from his inner malice and drawing out only its minimal powers, Guts can boost his base stats immensely. Even if he succumbs to it for a short while, with the help of Shirke and the Moonlight Boy, he can enter a controlled Berserker state, where he utilizes the armor's benefits without surrendering his ego to it. In this state, the Berserker armor's helm transforms into a half-helm, and its glowing red eyes open up to reveal Guts' eyes, indicating that he's the one in control. But the circumstances have changed drastically from that day at this point in the story, and what's worse is, Guts might be dying already. Right after his first usage of the Berserker armor, Guts' hair took on a white fringe because of the immense stress his body had endured. Every subsequent usage of the armor melted the flesh right off his bones, as if he was starving himself or something. Guts' muscled physique is well known in the anime community, but after constantly using the armor, he has become a literal shell of himself, and after seeing him not even put up a fight against his Kushan captors in chapter 375, we don't even know if he's physically fit to fight anymore. While a lot of Guts' current condition has a lot to do with him suffering a total mental breakdown, our minds and bodies are connected. The worse our mental state is, the worse our physical state becomes, and Guts is wearing armor that preys on negativity. We already know that the Skull Knight died fighting in the Berserker armor thanks to the blood memory we saw in chapter 362. Guts has been walking the struggler's path just like him, and his fate and death were sealed the day he got branded. It's possible that when he wakes up from his current condition, he will put on one final display of sanity for giving himself over to his darkness in front of Griffith and doing what the Beast of Darkness entreated him to do in chapter 373. The Berserker armor might end up killing Guts, and it might just take a couple of his friends with him, considering just how much foreshadowing there's been for that to happen across the series. And the day that happens will be the day Guts is finally free of his burdens. Or who knows, maybe he'll end up like Skull Knight because of it. Marvelous verdict! What we do know is that this is where the video is going to end, because that's all we've got for you guys on this one. The Berserker armor is one of the most unique armors in all of fiction, and it's all because of its seemingly sentient anatomy. But that's enough out of us. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments down below, and we'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.